the letters. As Christians, we believe in original sin. And this means something more than what we might expect. It really is this idea that people have a disposition which, given the circumstances of our world, we may do things which are bad. It doesn't mean that we all going around doing extraordinarily and explicitly evil things every moment. There are people who are moving away from that. As God's holiness and transformation comes into our lives, we find that we can move away from sin. But the question we have for us as a people is this: what does it mean for us to be the children of God? There's a beautiful verse opening up the first epistle of John, chapter 3, stating this: "See what kind of love the Father has given us, that we should be called the children of God." And so we are. The reason why the world does not know us is that it did not know Him. Now, there's an interesting distinction made even within this verse. Again, as Christian people, we need to be people capable of making distinctions. One of the distinctions made here is that God has made us children of God, and that is something to be in awe of. And this fact that we are children of God, it emerges out of the love that the Father has given us. Moreover, the world does not know us when it does not know God. As children of God, there are a few things that we really should contemplate and consider. There are three in particular points that I would like to point out really quick. One, as children of God, we know that we live under the jurisdiction of God. There is no separation between children of God in terms of class. Two, as children of God, we live under a universal will and moral code, which is applicable in all of our actions and situations in life, including times when we are alone and times when we are in public. 3. As children of God, we are created in the image of God. Therefore, we are beings of will. Moreover, we are moral beings capable of making moral decisions. Now that we've heard these 3 points, we must realize that our world does not recognize a lot of these elements. They do not see that people have a universal, applicable will and moral code. They do not want to understand that people are beings of will. Again, earlier we talked about Alfie Evans. In that situation, it's almost as if the UK government thinks that it is the arbiter of will and morality. It doesn't see the parents as being beings with personal agency capable of making moral decisions. They think they're the only ones capable of making moral decisions. Another thing that we see from that is that what we do in private and what we do in public should always follow moral code. Again, so many times you see things which are bureaucratic agencies. They want to hide their behaviors. It's hard to find blame in those situations. If you're a child of God, you know that no matter where you are, your actions matter. Another thing that happens in our world is they want to separate us out into classes. Here in Western civilization, there's a lot of people really tearing apart our cultures by saying there are classes which are privileged, those which are oppressed. They want to divide people up into subsections and forget that people are actually individuals. So, as we look at this, I want us to contrast what it means to be children of God versus people who are not. As children of God, one of the things that we should understand that we, as a people, believe in original sin. And now you might think this is a peculiar thing to bring up. I brought this up at the beginning of this segment, and I'm going to bring it up again now. One of the things that really separates out people who are the children of God versus people who do not recognize the children of God is that people who are Christians, people who are understanding that they live under the jurisdiction of the kingdom of God, we understand that people have this tendency to do bad things in the world. When we ask people in our world around us, are people inherently good or are people inherently bad? And for those of you listening, you may hear a few bumps on the microphone. I'm not used to this new microphone, so we're having fun with that. But anyways, the question, are people inherently good or are people inherently bad? It's a serious question. As Christians, if we are taught that we have original sin, this doesn't mean that we go around feeling guilty of some personal guilt, but it's an understanding that as a whole, our species has a tendency to do bad. Wherever our populations are, evil and corruption will manifest in some way or another. We're being torn apart by people who do not believe that, left to their own resources, people will do bad things. Pretty much throughout history, people have kind of understood that human nature is to do some bad things. And as children of God, we realize that we pray to God every day that we could have transformation out of this, that we could move to a better way of living. Here recently, I've been reading a novel by Fyodor Dostoevsky, who is a Russian novelist back from the 19th century. In particular, I've been reading his 1866 novel, Crime and Punishment. And if you are looking for a novel to read, if you're someone who likes to read or listen to audiobooks in the car, I really encourage you to read Crime and Punishment, because it's something which, while I don't consider the book evil, and I don't think Dostoevsky is a villain, he introduces a lot of concepts which I think, and I think you can make a strong case for this, these were the ideas which brought a lot of destruction into our world. I don't think Dostoevsky himself wanted to see this destruction happen, but I think he was just a bit skeptical as he looked at the world around him. He recognized that suffering was everywhere, and he kind of just asks a few questions of why is there suffering. But he makes a suggestion that maybe there is not original sin, maybe people aren't really bad, and maybe there is no distinction between a child of God and being someone who is not. So I want to read a little bit out of Dostoevsky's novel, because I've been reading this, and the second chapter in this novel is very interesting. And before I read this, I want to give you an overview of what's happening in this novel. It's a novel that follows a man who's going through life, and he's got a few moral crises he has. And in chapter 2, this man, he goes into a tavern and he meets a guy who's drunk. And the drunk guy tells out his story of life. He says, I'm married to a lady, and this is her second marriage. It's my second marriage as well. I had a daughter, and she had 3 children of her own. And we're in this place where we're very poor. So many afflictions have happened to us. My wife, she's the child of nobility. She's had a lot of great things in life, but I've come along and I've squandered it. In fact, the drunk man kind of opens up his monologue saying, I am a pig. He comes in and says, all this suffering is in my life, and I've done things to cause the suffering. I've taken advantage of my daughter. I've seen my daughter sold into a very undesirable lifestyle. I've even stolen from my own wife, stolen from my children, done things where they won't have money to eat off of. And eventually the drunk man, he decides it's time for him to go home. He had a few days earlier stole the money from his wife, and he decides it's time for him to go home. And as he goes back to his house, his wife comes out and she sees him and she says, oh, there you are, the thief, the criminal. And his wife, she kind of starts to beat him. She has him down on the ground and is dragging him by his hair. And the drunk man realizes that he has done a lot of evil things and bad things in his life, which has caused him to be in this place. There's been causes and effects which have brought him here. But he makes a statement at the end of this lengthy chapter. Again, it's a lengthy chapter in the book, which sounds so nihilistic. It's going on to the sufferings in the world. Everybody has sufferings, and even this man here who's a drunk, he says, I am the cause of all of this suffering. But in the last sentence in the chapter, he challenges this. And I'm going to read this last statement in the chapter for you. And what if I am wrong? He cried, suddenly after a moment's thought. What if man is not really a scoundrel? Man in general, I mean, the whole race of mankind. Then all the rest is prejudice, simply artificial terrors, and there are no barriers, and that's all as it should be. What we find in this Dostoevsky novel is a man who is recognizing that there's suffering in the world and that he has very well much caused a lot of it. There's suffering for other characters in this chapter. His wife, who hasn't really caused a lot of it. Her first husband died in the bit of a tragedy. And his own daughter, who has done things to, well, they were dishonorable things, but she did it out of love, trying to get money for the family. And you see all of this suffering here. Some of it's caused by people's personal decisions, some of it's not. And the drunk man recognizes that his own moral agency has caused the suffering. But in a moment's thought towards the end, he says, what if I am wrong? What if being a scoundrel isn't really being a scoundrel? What if it's all just prejudice? What if the reason why people suffer in reality isn't because of a cause and effect relationship between bad decisions or unfortunate circumstance, but what if the reason why we suffer is because something is oppressing us? Something out there has prejudice against us. Then there is nothing. They're just all artificial terrors. There are no barriers in reality, no distinctions to be made. Dostoevsky was writing this in the middle of the 1800s. Of course, we all who know history know what happened in Russia shortly thereafter that. Communism comes in, socialism comes in, and millions, tens of millions, close to 100 million people are killed by internal suppression and internal violence within Russia by the government. Socialism and communism, a lot of times people think, oh, it's this idea of sharing, and they even try to connect this to the New Testament. The New Testament is not about involuntarily forcing people through compulsion to separate causes and effects in this world. That is not what the New Testament is about. And that's really what communism was about. It wanted to separate causes and effects. It wanted to force people through involuntary compulsion to share resources that wasn't really sharing. Again, charity by compulsion is not actually charity. But it all came out of these thinkers from the 19th century, and I really think Dostoevsky was very instrumental in all of this, even though I don't think he was intentional about it. But he proposed this idea: what if I'm wrong? What if we are wrong that there is original sin? What if we are wrong that people actually are bad? What if being a scoundrel isn't the reason why my life is terrible? What if the reason why my daughter has to make these terrible decisions? What if the reason why my wife lives in terrible conditions isn't because of tragic and unfortunate circumstances? Which, again, as you read the book, some of them are tragedies, some of them are personal choices. What if the suffering that is inherent in life is out there because of someone else's prejudice? And this is an idea we still have going on today. People like to separate classes apart, say, oh, there's victimized groups and there are oppressed groups, and there are those who are doing the oppressing, those who are doing the victimizing. And they look at this, and it's a very terrible thing. It's a very evil thing when people think this way. But as we look at Dostoevsky, we see this idea being introduced that people do not have inherent sin, and that people aren't really children of God because there are no distinctions. There are no barriers. There are no children of God and those who are, as we find in the the Epistle of John, the children of the devil. They're just all the same. Well, anyways, we're going to wrap up our conversation with a little bit of a dialogue, and I was just going to throw this over to Anthony to see what his thoughts were on the question: what does it mean to be a child of God and to be people who are transformed out of the human nature to do bad things? What are your thoughts, Anthony?
I wish that you had asked me before you elaborated on it, because now, of course, my explanation won't be near as good. But I feel like, to be a child of God, and really to be a child of anybody's, is to be under their protection, care, and, also their teaching. But another thing to look at as being a child of God is that, we should be like him. We should be godly. And I think, that's kind of, some people might think that that's dangerous language. Oh, no, you shouldn't try to be like God, per se. You know what I mean? But, God is righteous, and so I think that we should try to be righteous for that. And I think that part of it is almost inherent, especially with the baptism of the Holy Spirit, that if we truly are his children, then we should be indeed righteous, like he is. And we should strive to be like him in every way that we really could, if you ask me. But
we are people capable of making distinctions. And one of the distinctions that we should make is saying that I want to be Christ-like, wanting to be godly in your life, does not equate with the idea of saying, well, I want to be God. Wanting to be Christ-like and wanting to say, I am the Messiah, are different things. They certainly are different things. And we need to make those distinctions there, because there are a lot of people who say, well, we can't be God-like. We can't be Christ-like. And those are totally different concepts.
Yeah,
Saying that I want to emulate Christ's behavior in my life, I want to be transformed into the holiness of God, is a different thing of saying I want to kick God out of the picture and let myself be God.
The one thing I've heard several times, which I find so interesting, is that, whenever I'm trying to make a moral decision, and sometimes it might be involving self-sacrifice, some people will always say, like, you're not Jesus, you're not Christ, you don't have to do that if you don't want to, even though it's a moral thing, it's a moral dilemma, whatever it may be, and I might have to make a sacrifice for it. A lot of times, bystanders who are not particularly Christian or who aren't strong in their faith yet will say something along those lines, and that always blows my mind, because that's not even like from the side of carrying Christ's authority into a situation, or perhaps bringing the judgment of consideration. That's just making a moral decision, and people will feel that way. You're not Jesus, so you don't have to do that.
Well, people are always looking for a reason to mitigate their own responsibility. Again, even Dostoevsky, I don't think Dostoevsky is actually a villain, though I think a lot of his philosophy, even though he's more of a novelist than a philosopher, but he's very much a philosopher. I think a lot of his thoughts and the logic he uses, it's not explicitly evil itself, but it, again, without discipline, people will take something to its pathological and destructive conclusion. I think people took Dostoevsky's work to imply a lot of evil things. And I think one of the things that comes out of this, well, hey, I'm not Christ, I'm not God. It doesn't matter whether I'm a scoundrel or a righteous person. It's all the same. There's no barriers. There's just artificial terrors in the world. It's just prejudice that's put me here. Therefore, I live like I want to live, and then I screech that I'm not Christ, I'm not whatever, and people remove all moral responsibility. As children of God, we do have moral responsibility. We must never forget that. Well, we're going to wrap up our program today. Thank you for joining us. If you really liked our content, please share it. If you loved our content and would like to support us monetarily, you can donate through Patreon at patreon.com/kingdomofthelogos. Of course, we do have our free podcast up for downloading on iTunes Castbox. iTunes, Castbox, and wherever you get podcasts. The RSS feed comes out of SoundCloud to a lot of different places, so we're on SoundCloud as well. And again, that's free to download. You can take us with you. And again, as always, remember that you are a child of God. And on that note, have a blessed day.